Kia ora and welcome to Comfort.ai, making artificial intelligence your comfort zone. And welcome to the 10th episode of Ethics Talks. And I am very glad to have Frances Valentine here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
So good to be here.
Thank you. So you don't need much of an introduction, but I'm still going to ask you, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So fundamentally, I'm in education, and in fact, in postgraduate education more specifically, and really looking at how do professionals stay in touch with technologies and how do they apply them in their lives so that they can actually really embrace the technology that can increase their impact in the world. How I got there, though, is through the technology pathway. I was living in Europe and I had exposure to some of the greatest technologies of the time. But when I came back into New Zealand, admittedly in the 1990s, the internet sort of felt like it hadn't really reached this country yet. It sort of felt like we were still sitting in the shadow of what was going on in the rest of the world. And so when I looked across, the workforce and into companies, it's like, where are we embracing technology and who is training in this? And so I took the opportunity to say, well, this is the area I really am fascinated by. And it was a time where the internet was coming around. We were starting to look at software, more specifically away from just very narrow areas of software. Like, people started having not just Word and Excel. We were starting to think about software that did specific jobs.
Right. Okay.
And also, it's really hard to imagine now just even loading a software program back then was multiple disks. And in fact, when I first commenced my journey, we were still using floppy disks and zip disks and things. So things have changed really rapidly.
Yeah.
And really for me, I just keep focused on the technology of today. And of course, it totally evolves and changes all the time. And so my two key businesses, the MindLab and Tech Futures Lab, we are focused on the technologies that impact across all sectors. So it doesn't matter if you're in health or education or you're in logistics or, computing or finance, everybody's grappling with this change. And our particular specialization is for people who are sort of over the age of sort of mid-30s through to around the mid-50s.
Okay.
They all study with us part-time. And so they have a day job, and then study with us part-time as they negotiate this change that's happening in the world.
Cool. Awesome. I've also heard that you mentor.
Yeah, so I have a number of side hustles which are around mentoring, particularly young women. And so right from high school age right through, so I have a number of women I mentor on a one-to-one basis. I have an organisation I'm part of with 8 other amazing women called On Being Bold, and we actually focus on development of programs for a lot of females. We run events also for females at school, so year 13 girls. I also have a part of a program that mentors young women in India. So basically every semester of the year, I have a different woman I mentor one-on-one in India. So it's something I'm really passionate about. The connection is always around STEM.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a really big part of it.
Yeah. No, awesome. They're so lucky to have you as a mentor.
I actually learn a lot more than they do, I'm sure.
That's amazing. So you touch on quite a few different points that I kind of want to dig into. So internet technology, diversity and equity is one. Before we go down this route, I just want to know at a high level, what's your definition of ethics?
Look, I think ethics for me go alongside with purpose. It's if you're doing something that do no harm, first and more. So whatever you're involved with, I totally believe you can never do harm. And in fact, you're trying to make it better than whatever you're doing. You're enriching it in a positive way. But I also think it is tied to purpose in terms of if you align it to your own purpose, then actually you're really pointing it into a very sharp point of what is ethical to you and holding yourself to account. You can put frameworks in place and you can do things that you want everybody else to align to an ethical kind of framework. But actually on an individual basis, I think you really have to know what your purpose is. Otherwise, where does it land? And so I always bring it back to what do I believe in and what do I believe to be ethical? And is it something I'm proud of? Yeah,
and you should be. So with that definition of ethics, what do you think is the role of ethics in education?
And I think education is going through quite a challenging time. And actually a lot of that is because of the internet, is because actually it's really hard to understand what is truth.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of the days where you had peer-reviewed, whether it be articles or if you went into an academic library, you could be absolutely certain that whatever you took off the shelf, it had some credibility to it. And so ethics had already been taken into consideration. There is obviously people holding people to account on the ethics of any study that they're doing. I think today, because the source of information is fundamentally not scrutinized, there is no editing kind of focus. Nobody is saying, is this credible anymore?
Yeah.
And so you put a lot of onus back onto the individual to decide, is the fact that you've been serving up as factual? How do you know that they're coming from a good source or ethical source of information? Yeah. How do you validate that? And so in education, I think the big part of it is that discovery of how do you know that what you're doing is ethical or what you're actually referencing in itself is ethical.
Yeah.
And now that in itself has become a really challenging process. And so when we have our postgraduate students who, doing their masters, for example, and we challenge them and saying, how do you know that study is ethical?
Yeah.
It's actually really hard to go back to source and saying, how do we know how that was done? And how do we know there wasn't a bias built into it? Or how do we know there wasn't some form of influence across that study? Because it's not peer reviewed in the same way.
Yeah.
It's not sitting in a journal where you know that you've got that scrutiny that's been applied to it before it even sees the light of day. So it can be quite challenging now.
Yeah. And I guess it's like the amount of information available is so much
abundant,
that you can't go dive into every single individual piece. So it sounds like trust then becomes a big issue.
Yeah, I think trust to me is the big winner of the future. I think the more an individual, a company, organization, a political party can actually base themselves on trust that can be validated, I think we're all looking for the truth. Yeah. We're all looking to have something that can be trusted because there is so much in life now that we don't know. There's shadows within what we do of how do we know, how do we validate? And I know there is a number of technologies that are addressing these very issues. How do you take things back to source? How do you validate? And I think the more distributed that we think about the future, then I think we'll build more trust into it because there won't be, if you think of some of the old structures, all of the truth was hidden at the top and it was really hard to penetrate. And I think as we're getting into more distributed organizations and as we're starting to think about communities, I think there's more accountability, but also some of the shutters have come down and you can see into organizations a little bit more. And so I think it is a time where if we can talk about truth and trust as individuals or organizations and talk about why and how we can be trusted, I think that's going to make a huge difference in the future. Yeah. And I think COVID in a way did a little bit of that, that we looked for the trusted source of information and we saw what it looked like for sources of information that didn't necessarily come from a point of trust. Yeah. And what happened with that information and how poisoning it can be for people and individuals who don't know whether or not what the information is real or not. Yeah, true. Because it divided people as well. It divided families. Yeah. I think it was, and I suspect it's still dividing families. Yeah. Because it has consequences that flow on, for years and maybe decades to come. Yeah, exactly. Especially when around the vaccine, I remember do I get it? Do I not get it? All the conspiracies and all of that. Yeah, that's the source of information when it comes to education. That's interesting. It's something that's never come up. So I'm glad we're touching on. Well, actually, even becomes more profound. In our very first master's program we had for teachers, the first assessment, there was a disproportionate number of people referencing the same articles. And actually we thought there was maybe a cohort of, say, 80 teachers. And we were saying, how can it be of all the abundance of information that everybody seems to be referencing the same material? And then we were thinking, is this like some form of plagiarism that's coming? Because these teachers were across the country. So we're saying, is there some kind of underworld sharing of information or someone's writing and sort of co-writing these papers? And then we realised is actually teachers on a whole are aged in their 50s, mostly a female. They live in New Zealand. And so the algorithms that they were being pushed to through Google were the same articles that they were going through. It wasn't until someone who really understood, the algorithms of search that said to us, hang on, do they even know about incognito as a Chrome browser? Are they searching without their preferences? Are they looking at scholarly articles? How are they using Google? That we realized we had to train teachers of how Google works so that they weren't actually coming back with the same references and the same material because of sitting within the same demographic. Yeah. And the only way we discovered that is we looked at who did not use those references, and we realized they were the anomalies in the group by age or by gender or by location or by the other things. And we're like, why are these people getting different things?
Wow.
And so it became this really interesting, and it just really goes to show that when you fit a certain profile and a certain characteristics, age, location, and on top of it, profession, things actually start getting quite narrow.
Yeah, they do. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression.
Wow. Okay.
I'll include the link for anyone who's watching this. But it's exactly on the bias on the search engines. I have noticed that, even though sometimes people don't believe me, is that especially we are based in New Zealand, and I have, my male counterparts looking for some sort of an information who are based in the US. And the things they come up with and the things that I come up with can sometimes be completely different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the importance of things like incognito are so important as a browser option.
Yeah.
Because people have fought very hard to make sure that's an option.
Yeah.
So we really need to use it. We need to take that privilege of having a tool that takes away all those biases and says, oh, you're a new person. Let's discover something completely new.
Yeah. So how do you think this then reflects into, because we're talking about a technology here, right? And you've touched on technology, you've touched on the internet, algorithms. So it's kind of like a segue into what we talk about, which is AI. How do you think, this monumental amount of information with these, biases, and how do you think that then impacts the students? Because, that's where all the students get their information from. I don't think anyone goes to the library anymore.
No, and I think this is a really important skill set we need to teach people.
Right.
And in fact, recently on another podcast, we were talking about this idea of who teaches people how to use the internet. We just assume that everybody knows how to search. But actually there are multiple different ways you search and actually to validate. So I do think for students, what we want is people to be operating in the margins of information. So they're not coming back to the same, the first 3 things that are served to you on Google, or the ones that have been paid through AdWords, or the ones that are popular because they're controversial. Yeah. What we want is to say, okay, let's go further into the search function and actually start looking at material that perhaps is known to be from more recognizably credible sources. But then even within those, how do we make sure that we're not just seeing things because they're popular? Yeah. And so it does take skill, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that takes time to teach people how to use the internet. Yeah. And I think it's particularly interesting when you meet with conspiracy theorists. And, it's a very difficult conversation because, you cannot question someone's belief. If somebody wants to believe something, then it's their own prerogative. But when you know that where they're sourcing the information from is not credible, it's a very tricky road to walk down with them. But we have to do that with students because, everybody does have strange ideas sometimes because they've landed down some rabbit hole that has made them believe something. Yeah. And it could just be a sensational news item that's got no basis of truth. And so a lot of it, I love teaching, and when I'm teaching a class, and I actually take the first session, for example, of our Master of Technological Futures, the very first session I run, and I love it, but in that sort of session, we start talking about truth. Yeah. We start talking about this very topic about people bring a whole raft of experience into a room, particularly if they're adults, when you've got years of experience. And some of it is going to be really powerful to know, and you'll learn from each other. And some of it you need to understand just needs to be left where it was. It's not going to add value because actually it was experiences that can't be shared because they were very personal experiences, and they actually perhaps need to stay kept away from the education environment. And I mean that not in a control way, but in we have to think about which experiences, which papers, which studies, which research is valid and important to the work you're doing, and which of it perhaps has had its time and no longer needs to be surfaced again. And so, because it's particularly around technology and ethics, it keeps changing because we're dealing with ethical challenges now that we couldn't even imagine. And putting aside AI, I mean things like CRISPR is a great example where we have no idea of the ethical challenges that are ahead of us as we start thinking about gene editing. And so we have to keep reimagining what those issues and challenges are. So if we go back to Dolly the sheep and cloning, it's probably not the best reference point now because it's a different time and place. And so I'm always this great believer we're a product of everything we are and what we've done is really important, and we have to kind of filter about how much of that stuff is still relevant today and really important to carry forward, and how much of it we need to look for new information. And technology is particularly challenging in that between these two worlds. And if you have that situation where someone says, I've been in IT for 30 years and I can tell you all about IT. Maybe not. Maybe in some cases, yes, but actually, and so we have to make sure that we don't get overly indexed by what we experienced. And it might be, I implemented this major change project with some IT software and it went terribly, therefore all IT software projects are going to be terrible. So this is this bit around what do we leave behind and what are we open to new ideas.
It sounds like teaching people to have adaptability skills and challenging their own bias. That seems like the most important skill
very much
in
so
education.
And we all carry biases.
It's
part of who we are, and we're a product of the people around us and our own experiences. And I think feeling comfortable with being challenged is actually a great skill to learn. And it does have to be learned. We always say it's about being above the line and being willing and able to learn, as opposed to below the line, which is closed and having to be right. What we don't want, particularly for adults who are trying to move through this world of ethics and technology, is for them to say, I already know this, I'm already right. Because actually that is where it becomes incredibly self-limiting, particularly for a career where people are looking for much more expansive knowledge. They're looking for that adaptability and the ability to kind of take what's coming forward and making sense of it. Which is very hard if you're using all your references from the past.
That's true. So there's you mentioned above the line, below the line. I love that video. And I'll make sure to include the link for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's one of the best videos I ever saw.
Great. And we all can relate to it. We know those people. We go, oh, you're a below the line person.
Exactly. It's interesting, the stuff you're talking about, because I can see it. You're talking about it from an education perspective, and then you can see how that reflects in an actual workplace. I think one of the challenges I've seen is when you are that person that goes, you know what, I have some experiences or I have a lot of experience, but I'm not going to just count on that. Sometimes you can come across as a little bit not so confident or not so credible because they ask you such and such, and then you'll be like, well, actually, this is my experience, but I'm not sure in this case. And I think sometimes people cannot take the I'm not sure bit. And they want you to be like so 100% absolute. This is, and that's how they find confidence in you. It's a very interesting challenge at workplace.
Look, and I think it comes back to truth. There are people who are, self-proclaimed experts in everything. And over time, we learn that perhaps they're not. That their way of building their own esteem is often attached to, I have to be right. And the people who often are deeply sort of thoughtful and actually are often doing these things are often the ones who don't actually have a huge amount of esteem attached to it. They will be saying, I'm on this journey and I think this is really relevant and interesting part of what we're doing, but it's not fully validated yet. And so then people sort of dismiss them. And then there's the cultural aspect of that. And, here in New Zealand, we do the self-depreciating thing naturally, particularly women, where we say, oh yeah, but I'm not so good at that. And then on a cultural side, you'll get an American who will say, you know, the bravado is a big part of their culture of like, I'm so good at this. So then there's this huge divide because, you know, if you go in, and I know when I was first told to pitch to a US investors saying, if you go in being really modest, they're going to assume that you're already inflating yourself. So they're going to assume that you're even less capable than that. Whereas, you know, this is a real challenge in itself. It's sort of like, how do we hear the truth of people who really know and who are credible amongst the sort of noise of people who are, you know, extroverted or they're very confident. And I think this happens particularly with young people where they're coming into the world or the workplace with huge amounts of new knowledge. They see it, they experience it every day, they understand communities, they understand networks, they understand technology. They go and work in an organisation who hasn't arrived there yet. And so when they come in and start talking about, you know, any form of this technology and they're like, I don't understand it, therefore they're sort of dismissed. And I think we lose a lot of real knowledge by dismissing young people, particularly those who are coming out of academic environments where they've deeply explored some of these emerging technologies and the impact. And I think ethics is a great example. But, you know, I think as we think about if somebody has spent years working could be questionable, playing esport games.
Right.
And they're there and they're working in these environments with large, vast communities. And they are forming networks and they understand the technology that enables that. And they actually have formed spin-outs out of that using cryptocurrencies on the blockchain and things. All of that, if you go into a workplace and you kind of hide it, it's like this is a piece of yourself you're not going to talk about because nobody knows the stuff or nobody will understand. And it's seen to be frivolous. But actually that knowledge is huge.
Yeah.
Like it's this vast array of experience and knowledge around how technology works, what's coming, how people are adopting it, you know, where that could come. What would that be if you took it as a catalyst of the future? Then you'd go, well, there's something there, like Web3. What does that look like? If you're 24, it looks very different than if you're 44.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's also one of the reasons I'm glad we went down this route because it also brings up a lot of the diversity requirements when it comes to developing a new technology. And I always talk about, you know, diversity as multidimensional. So there's a lot of talk about gender diversity, which is great. And then when I also talk about it, I add to that the fact that you need to have age diversity and talent diversity.
Neurodiversity.
Yeah. Yeah, cultural diversity, everything. Yeah. So part of the intention of the channel, Comfort AI, is particularly with ethics talks, is to help guide people, especially those who want to kind of embark on a journey with AI, but then, you know, they would touch a particular sector. So what would you recommend someone who wants to develop something with artificial intelligence for education sector? What would be, you know, an advice that you can give them, something to think about?
Sure. I think the first thing, education is a reputation industry. Like it is entirely on reputation. And so the credibility of an institute is driven by how credible the outputs are, the people come out, which is why we have, you know, ratings and rankings of universities. It's why we look at certain programs having prestige, because we hold programs and institutes to account. And so if you go into anything around ethics and education, you have to remember that. So the first thing people are looking for is reputation and credibility. So the starting point is, how do you start an ethical conversation to evidence that you and yourself and your business are ethical? Because by association, every institute who's of any institute who is credible wants to make sure they're partnering with credible organizations. And there is a lot of, for example, software in the education market, particularly targeting for children. And I look at it and it's completely a commercial build. There is nothing that shows the ethical or even the education outcomes are there. It is, it's sort of sensationalized and it's built on the basis of profit. And you can see it, but they're actually, because they have a lot of noise and a lot of marketing and cut through, and eventually, people recognize that they may not be learning from this. So I think if you're going into education it is really important to start off with saying, how do I evidence how ethical we are and the steps we're taking to validate what we're doing is effective and ethical, and it achieves the successes we're saying, because people will take more notice of those things, I think, in education than they perhaps would in, say, retail, where they may be, it's not, the reputation is a lesser factor than it is when you're talking about knowledge exchange.
Yeah, exactly. And I have a question that I feel like if I don't ask you, I'm going to get a lot of comments on why I didn't ask you. But what do you think about robot teachers? That's something that comes up quite a lot when I talk about AI in education.
So you're thinking more like a digital humans as opposed to like an actual robot?
Yes. Or a robot, like a humanoid robot or a digital human, but something, an entity other than an actual human teaching.
Look, I actually think in many cases I would have loved to have had a digital human teacher for some of my subjects, because if you look at education, deep specialists who can also teach are pretty hard to find.
Yeah.
Like, they're often a great teacher, but maybe their knowledge is not really deep. Or you have someone who hasn't really updated their knowledge for a long time, so they're teaching stuff that's kind of irrelevant. And so then you risk they might be a good teacher, but actually the stuff you're teaching can't be applied in the workforce when you leave because it's no longer a currency of knowledge. And then of course there's loads of situations where you just can't find a great teacher. If you want to, if you live in a rural town in almost any country in the world, getting a great physics teacher is going to be difficult, or a calculus teacher, or a mathematics teacher. So I actually am a huge fan, because actually what you're getting by a digital human in a way is perfect knowledge.
Yeah.
If the information and the source of the information is factual and it's contemporary and it comes from the accumulation of knowledge that is relevant and recent, then I think that piece is incredibly powerful for someone who wants to delve deep into calculus, for example.
Yeah.
If the communication style can be to the point where you cross that sort of uncanny valley, that they become believable enough in their own right, that teacher feels human enough that actually I'm not sitting there just looking going, this is a robot, or this is a humanoid, or this is a digital human. I think the digital humans today are so believable that they, that within a few minutes of watching them, you're watching an avatar who's almost so believably human, down to the freckles and the motions and the expressions and the empathy, then I say, well, actually, isn't this going to solve some of the challenges we have around access to great teachers?
Yeah.
But I think it comes back to the ethics point. How do we know the information they're sharing is not biased? It doesn't have some company underwriting the information that's been shared, or that some radical view has been infiltrated into the information that's sharing. So we have to make sure there's a neutral viewpoint within those topics. But I think it is the future. I don't think for a minute that we're not going to go that way at scale. I think it's going to be the solution. And that's because we have globally an aging teaching workforce, and teachers, the number of young people who want to go to teaching is definitely diminishing in most markets. We don't validate and reward and celebrate teachers at the level I think they deserve. And so it's not attracting people thinking, gosh, this is a really hard job and I'm not really getting the reward from it. So I think people have got so many options today. Yeah. And the differential between the salary of a teacher now and a 24-year-old university grad in STEM, there's a void between these two incomes. And, as the world gets more expensive to live in, people are having to look at where are the incomes, where are the salaries that will enable me to do the things I want to do. And that's, unfortunately, going to be harder and harder for teachers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, less teachers, but if done ethically, it sounds like it's a technology that can enable accessibility.
I think accessibility and language, you can accommodate language, and I saw a great technology the other day with sign language with avatars. I think we've got, it's going past just captions. I think we're starting to understand with natural language processing, some really great technologies enable that the teacher can be in delivering content in the language and style that suits you. Yeah. And I imagine you could choose, what type of teacher. You could choose your avatar probably when you get to humanoids and into robots, obviously it's less tested.
Yeah.
But I think the moment I see the best deployment of robots being more in things like healthcare for physical, where there's anywhere where there's health and safety or physical constraints. And places like Japan where you've got a very much an aging health workforce and having to physically pick up patients and move them to another bed makes more sense that some form of a robotic system will do that, as opposed to asking a 60-year-old nurse to lift a patient, which could put them into their own health and safety situation. So I think the physical robot humanoid is definitely further downstream, and I think that will really come down to how we keep learning. Is it still in a physical class environment over time, or do we do more and more learning online and we supplement it with a lot more of the sort of social interaction around learning that is sort of the softer skills, which may be hopefully through humans.
No, true. So when I say humanoid, I'm still thinking, traditional, classroom kind of thing. But of course, technologies.
I don't think we're going to have, there's going to have to be a very good reason to go to a lecture theatre in 5 years' time.
Right. Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Because, actually, if you're not socialising in that lecture theatre, you're not connecting, because it's really a one-to-many involved, it's not really a collaborative experience.
Yeah.
And you have to travel, which has carbon footprint issues, and you can't work in your sort of social economy or in the gig economy or whatever it might be you're doing on the side, that people will start saying, if I can do that same experience from a great online digital avatar, digital human who can do that for me, and I can do the socializing in other ways, and I can get the other skills I need, I think, and at a lower cost.
Yeah.
Then I think we're going to start seeing some very, very big shifts in education.
Interesting. Thank you for that. That was great insights. Look, I think we can talk for hours and hours on this, but I am going to conclude this, and then if there are questions from the audience, I always go back to the guests and ask them. Fantastic. But there is one question I always ask at the end. Is there anything you wanted me to ask you that I didn't?
Look, nothing you didn't. I think you asked great questions, and this has been such a thrill. I think the main thing is the need for people to keep learning has never been more profound.
Yeah.
And the information and the knowledge we learned last year, we need to sort of sense check it to make sure that's still relevant. And with the emerging technologies we have and the advances in science, there is better information all the time. And so I think it's more of a call out to people watching. It's just making sure that we don't fall back on what we knew to be true, because it probably was true.
Yeah.
But actually things keep moving ahead. And for me, it's, my greatest joy is discovering and replacing knowledge and saying, gosh, what I thought last year is no longer the case. This is where it's gone. And so really making sure that we don't get caught in the way things were in a world that's rapidly evolving.
Yeah. Great one. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was great. So thank you everyone for watching, or if you're listening, please let me know if you have any questions for me or for Francis. And until the next episode of Ethics Talks, remember, technology can be fun, fashionable, and fabulous.
Wonderful.